We are today on the beginning of the second week of Season 4. A few cool things are happening right now. Players are getting their second bullion to buy themselves their first best in slot item. I hope you choose the correct one. We're also getting, of course, our first vault of the season, so good luck to anyone who's about to open their vault, just like I am right now. And then, of course, an even higher chance for everyone to finish their 4-piece set bonus of Season 4, especially to all the players getting a new tier set compared to what they had in Season 3. However, since week 1 is over, we are done now with the first tyrannical week in Mythic class and the first raid of the season, Vault of the Incarnates. It's time to go back and answer some of the questions players might have gotten from the first week of the season. You know, to clear some doubts, some curiosities players might have about what's been happening, like, for example, we can start with what's going down with Marksmanship Hunter. Why have they been doing pretty well in the first week of Mythic Plus, and why have they topped the damage meters in Mythic Vault of the Incarnates in week 1? Their tier set has remained the same from Season 3, and they have not received any balance tuning. So what's going on right now? Well, the answer in the simplest TLDR is that Marksmanship Hunter is a very target capped kind of spec. They base most of their damage on trick shots when it comes to AoE. So you want to hit with multi-shot 3 or more targets, and then your aim shot or rapid fire will spread to 5 extra targets, which means the maximum sweet spot for your damage is 6 targets. And then the best sweet spot would be about 4 targets. That's because at 5 or 6 there are other specs that can also do very well, whereas at around 4 you are kind of the best spec. Which means, especially in the raid, the more fights you can have with 4 to 5-ish targets, the better you can do. And it just so happened in Vault of the Incarnates that you had multiple fights, like for example Council, where Marksmanship Hunter could show off exactly how much damage they can do when they can consistently hit 4 targets. Then even Eranog actually spawns 6 adds plus the boss 7 targets, so it's just 1 target over their sweet spot, but they're still doing very well. You also have Dathia. If you go upstairs in the add phase, Marksmanship can also do very well with all of those targets. In Kurog, you also have adds spawning every intermission, basically, where Marksmanship can do very well. Diurna, if you take the add group job, that's another situation of 4 to 5 to 6 targets where you can shine as a spec. That's why in the overall results, Marksmanship turned out to be very good. However, this is bound to go down now. Aberrus doesn't have nearly as many 4 to 5 to 6 target fights where Marksmanship can shine, and in Mythic Plus also things are bound to go further down for Marksmanship. That's because the first week players were more timid, they were more cautious, they weren't pulling nearly as big, and on top of that, keys were still at low level, meaning mobs would die very quickly, so specs with very fast ramp up damage could benefit a lot. But now that we start to get into higher and higher keys where mobs last for longer and pulls get bigger, that's where the value of Marksmanship will start going down. So both in the raid and in Mythic class, pretty much week 1 was the shining moment of the season for Marksmanship. A similar, but not nearly as bad, a similar situation you can also say for Windwalker. Windwalker has had a similar good performance at the beginning of week 1 when it comes to Mythic class. They also had a similar good performance at the beginning of week 1 for the raid, and for somewhat similar reasons, because if you go back to Eranog with the adds, Windwalker is doing very well. If you go back to Kurog with the adds, Windwalker is doing very well. If you go back to Diurna with the adds, Windwalker is also doing very well. So now into Aberrus, where pure single target damage will start mattering much more, specs without nearly as good of a pure single target damage will start to be doing worse, for example. And same in Mythic Plus, the value will go down compared to now, but not nearly as badly as with Marksmanship. Another question we might have is about what's going down with Red Paladin. So, Red Paladin finished last season as the clear top spec in DPS for like 2 months straight. Now, in week 1, they have already been outdone by a couple of specs, and they are fighting with a few others, especially in top damage. Red doesn't seem to be doing nearly as well. In the raid, we have somewhat similar. We finished 10.2.5 with Ret being the top damage and by far the most popular spec, even beating incredibly Beast Mastery, which has been our de facto most popular spec in the game, with a massive gap, almost twice as many as pretty much any other spec. Compared to the beginning of the season, before Ret got their legendaries and their 3 back-to-back buffs, Ret was still a popular spec, but not nearly as much. But then we look at now, and the first week of Mythic, Vault of the Incarnates, Ret was good, but nowhere near the best, or as much as the best as we saw towards the end of the last season. This is not, though, as bad as what we just talked about for Marksmanship Hunter. We wouldn't be ringing the doomer bells just yet for Retribution Paladin. It is true, you can see a pretty clear pattern right now for Ret. If you look at their average damage, they are super competitive with all of the top specs and easily beating all of the rest. But what really jumps to the eye is the top damage. You can see that the top damage of Ret is pretty much beaten by every other spec in the top 10, or even almost everyone in the top 15 of the specs right now in Mythic Plus. That's because Ret Paladin is a very front-loaded kind of spec. They can't really keep going after the first 15 seconds of a pull. The more things stay alive, the more Ret is going to be losing in damage compared to specs that can keep going for longer. Specs like Shadow, like Demo, like Destruction, but also Balanced Druid, even now the buff, the Devastation Evoker, Frost Mage as well. Those specs have more juice. Even BM Hunter, they have more consistent damage than a Ret Paladin. But the reason why it's not nearly as much of a doomer situation as Marksmanship is because it's the new season. Ret needs to re-upgrade its legendary once more, which will happen this week with the second Bullion. So you should be able to see the performance jump up again for Ret Paladin. Also because their spec is very heavily reliant on burst damage, they are also very heavily reliant on cooldown trinkets, which is unlike many other specs which are fine with stat stick, trinkets, etc. Ret not nearly as much. So essentially the point with Ret is they are still doing fine, they just need a bit more time to get back to where they were. Even then, they shouldn't be getting nearly in as much of a dominant state as they were, but still a very competitive option. Talking about another question mark, this time the question mark isn't for damage, but is for healing. The surprise, of course, was that through the first week of the Vault of the Incarnates Mythic difficulty, Mistweaver Monk was no longer the dominating option in the raid. No matter which statistics we looked at, we saw Preservation Evoker being overall the better ones, with a pretty even and matched clump of 5 specs in the middle. You see the gap between the second to last and second best healers is only 8,000 HPS. So we're talking about 2.5% of healing difference between these positions. Now, there is one thing that might actually bring some juicy changes when it comes to healers. And that's the fact that Priest number 1 and Priest number 2, but also the Monk and the Druid are keeping their tier set. So nothing is actually getting changed this week for them, but for Preservation, who is already first in healing, as well as Holy Paladin and Resto Shaman, they are getting their new tier set. What is particularly interesting is the Shaman change, because this new tier set is going to be so powerful, at the very least in the eyes of Blizzard, that Blizzard actually nerfed Resto Shaman in healing by 5% before this season even was out. So Shaman wasn't a meta healer last season, yet it was nerfed, because the assumption is that moving away from this Season 3's tier set back to Season 1 with more crit scaling in a season where you can get upwards of 40 or even 50% crit, the value of this will be massive, giving a lot of power to Resto Shaman. So the thought process is that this is bound to go much higher up and at the very least match Preservation Evoker in terms of power in the raid. Which is still good, because in terms of power, when it comes to Mythic Plus, that's not definitely the same thing. If we go over here to the meta, we can see Mistweaver and Restoration Druid as the two, choices for Mythic Plus. So that is the one possible change when it comes to healers. The incoming tier sets for Resto Shaman and Preservation Evoker in particular. The one for Holy Paladin shouldn't be nearly as valuable in this season. Now, a little bit of a question about Mythic Plus, because we just ended week 1, which was Tyrannical Storming and Raging. Now, admittedly, this is the good time to remind everyone of the new change, which I'm sure many will see as positive, of the fact that, yes, this week, indeed, there was also Raging. You might have completely forgotten about it because you only did +7s or 8s or 9s, because with this new Mythic Plus change, now you can farm your quests and your hero track gear without having to deal with the third affix of the season. So imagine how happy you are to discover that this week you only have to deal with entangling if you want to farm some gear, and you can completely ignore the existence of bolstering, for example. So besides uploading this pretty cool change in Mythic Plus, at least according to some, because according to others this is a terrible change since it allows players to get max Mythic Plus gear with an even easier time and less effort, because now keys are even easier, we can see the average difficulty of keys on week 1 being, of course, a far cry in terms of difficulty compared to what we are used to in our usual week 1s. Normally, the week 1 of Mythic Plus, you get to see the hardest dungeons in the 50 or even 40% range. Our records had some dungeons even as low down as 30% success rate. This week, though, you know, these ones being recycled dungeons, plus we are getting the nerfed version that was then further nerfed by Blizzard before the release of this season. So it's all dungeons everyone already knows about, plus they have been nerfed, so the overall difficulty has not been nearly as challenging. And then another reminder, many of these completions didn't even include the third affix. So in terms of challenge, this last week of Mythic Plus has been quite a breeze for most dungeons. They are quite, actually, as you can see, quite close to each other in terms of difficulty. You know, just as an absolutely PTSD throwback, this was actually week 1 of Dragonflight difficulty of Mythic Plus dungeons. There you go, have fun. So we're now done with the recap of what's been going down in week 1, from the results of the specs in both the Raid and Mythic Plus, but also some of the interesting or curious happenings in week 1, from some outliers in terms of damage, the situation for the healers, as well as how the first week of Mythic Plus went. So for today, on this Wednesday, we're now going to leave each other as we enter a new week of Season 4, and also getting ever closer to the release of WoW Remix for Mist of Pandaria. At this point, only 2 weeks away. So we are now going to say our goodbyes. Thanks, of course, as usual, to all of the Patreon supporters for the contribution and help to the growth of the channel, together with, of course, everyone who is supporting for free by liking and commenting down below on this video, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, sleeping for like only 3 hours today. I actually woke up after dreaming I woke up with the outside completely covered in snow. That's curious.